With you, I can be sad with you.
Gemini Studios was the favorite haunt of poets like S.D.S. Yogiyar, Shanku Subramaniam, Krishna Shastri, and Harindranath Chattopadhyaya. It had an excellent mess which supplied good coffee at all times of the day and for most part of the night. Those were the days when Congress rule meant prohibition, and meeting over a cup of coffee was rather satisfying entertainment. Barring the office boys and a couple of clerks, everybody else at the studios radiated leisure, a prerequisite for poetry. Most of them wore khadi and worshipped Gandhiji, but beyond that they had not the faintest appreciation for political thought of any kind. Naturally, they were all averse to the term communism. A communist was a godless man. He had no filial or conjugal love. He had no compunction about killing his own parents and his own children. He was always out to cause and spread unrest and violence among innocent and ignorant people. Such notions, which prevailed everywhere else in South India at that time, also naturally floated about vaguely among the khadi-clad poets of Gemini Studios. Evidence of it was soon forthcoming. When Frank Bushman's Moral Rearmament Army, some 200 strong, visited Madras sometime in 1952, they could not have found a warmer host in India than the Gemini Studios. Someone called the group an international circus. They weren't very good on trapeze, and their acquaintance with animals was only at the dinner table. But they presented two plays in a most professional manner. Their Jotham Valley and Forgotten Factor ran several shows in Madras, and along with the other citizens of the city, the Gemini family of 600 saw the plays over and over again. The message of the plays were usually plain and simple homilies, but the sets and costumes were first-rate. Madras and the Tamil drama community were terribly impressed, and for some years almost all Tamil plays had a scene of sunrise and sunset in the manner of Jotham Valley, with a bare stage, a white background curtain, and a tune played on the flute. It was some years later that I learned that the MRA was a kind of counter-movement to international communism, and the big bosses of Madras like Mr. Vazan simply played into their hands. I am not sure, however, that this was indeed the case, for the unchangeable aspects of these big bosses and their enterprises remained the same, MRA or no MRA, international communism or no international communism. The staff of Gemini Studios had a nice time hosting 200 people of all hues and sizes of at least 20 nationalities. It was such a change from the usual collection of crowd players waiting to be slapped with thick layers of makeup by the office boy in the makeup department. A few months later, the telephone lines of the big bosses of Madras buzzed, and once again we at Gemini Studios cleared a whole shooting stage to welcome another visitor. All they said was that he was a poet from England. The only poets from England the simple Gemini staff knew or heard of were Wordsworth and Tennyson. The more literate ones knew of Keats, Shelley and Byron, and one or two might have faintly come to know of someone by the name Eliot. Who was the poet visiting Gemini Studios now? He is not a poet, he is an editor. That's why the boss is giving him a big reception. Vasan was also the editor of the popular Tamil weekly Ananthavikatan. He wasn't the editor of any of the known names of British publications in Madras, that is, those known at the Gemini Studios. Since the top men of the Hindu were taking the initiative, the surmise was that the poet was an editor of a daily, but not from the Manchester Guardian or the London Times. That was all that even the most well-informed among us knew. At last, around 4 in the afternoon, the poet or the editor arrived. He was a tall man, very English, very serious, and of course, very unknown to all of us. Battling with half a dozen pedestal fans on the shooting stage, the boss read out a long speech. It was obvious that he too knew precious little about the poet or the editor. The speech was all in the most general terms, but here and there it was peppered with words like freedom and democracy. Then the poet spoke. He couldn't have addressed a more dazed and silent audience. No one knew what he was talking about, and his accent defeated any attempt to understand what he was saying. The whole thing lasted about an hour. Then the poet left, and all dispersed in utter bafflement. What are we doing? What is an English poet doing in a film studio which makes Tamil films for the simplest sort of people? People whose lives least afforded them the possibility of cultivating a taste for English poetry? The poet looked pretty baffled too, for he too must have felt the sheer incongruity of his talk about the thrills and travails of an English poet. His visit remained an unexplained mystery. The great prose writers of the world may not admit it, but my conviction grows stronger day after day that prose writing cannot be the true pursuit of a genius. It is for the patient, persistent, persevering drudge with a heart so shrunken that nothing can break it. Rejection slips don't mean a thing to him. He at once sets about making a fresh copy of the long prose piece and sends it on to another editor, enclosing postage for the return of the manuscript. It was for such people that the Hindu had published a tiny announcement in an insignificant corner of an unimportant page. A short story contest organized by a British periodical by the name The Encounter. Of course, The Encounter wasn't a known commodity among the Gemini literati. I wanted to get an idea of the periodical before I spent a considerable sum in postage sending a manuscript to England. In those days, the British Council Library had an entrance with no long-winded signboards and notices to make you feel you are sneaking into a forbidden area. And there were copies of The Encounter lying about in various degrees of freshness, almost untouched by readers. When I read the editor's name, I heard a bell ringing in my shrunken heart. It was the poet who had visited Gemini Studios. I felt like I had found a long-lost brother, and I sang as I sealed the envelope and wrote out his address. I felt that he too would be singing the same song at the same time. Long-lost brothers of Indian films discover each other by singing the same song in the first reel and in the final reel of the film. Stephen Spender. Stephen, that was his name. And years later, when I was out of Gemini Studios and had much time but not much money, anything at a reduced price attracted my attention. On the footpath in front of the Madras Mount Road post office, there was a pile of brand new books for 50 paise each. Actually, they were copies of the same book, an elegant paperback of the American origin. Special low-priced student edition in connection with the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. I paid 50 paise and picked up a copy of the book, The God That Failed. 6 eminent men of letters in 6 separate essays described their journeys into communism and their disillusioned return. Andre Gide, Richard Wright, Ignazio Silon, Arthur Koestler, Louis Fisher, and Stephen Spender. Stephen Spender. Suddenly the book assumed tremendous significance. Stephen Spender, the poet who had visited Gemini Studios. In a moment I felt a dark chamber of my mind lit up by a hazy illumination. The reaction to Stephen Spender at Gemini Studios was no longer a mystery. The boss of the Gemini Studio may not have much to do with Spender's poetry, but not with his God that failed. But not with his God that failed.
I can be sad with you. Just take my hand.